There's 12 of them that we're studying. They're laid out here on the screen. We've been walking through them each week, and hopefully you start to see that they function as exercises. Just like if you want to lose weight or want to get healthy, you go to the gym, you do your exercise. Prayer is like doing the bench press, or fasting is like getting on the treadmill. You do these exercises, but the intent is that you better yourself. And I've been saying this all along. These exercises, these practices, these disciplines, they are not the way to get to God, because he's already come to us through Jesus. They're not how we get to God. They're not how we become holier, but rather they're how we connect to God deeper. It's like having a relationship. You got to work at it. Any of you who have had relationships know they just don't come second nature. There's some discipline you have to have. There's some practices you have to put in place, and that's what we're walking through. And we get to this one today, which is confession. And it really was hard for me to think through this message over the last month or so and to write it out this week, because just saying that word confession, I don't know, to me it was heavy. I started thinking honestly of the going to the church with the little booth, and you go in the dark booth and the window slides open and you're supposed to pour your heart out, crying and weeping, and for penance. Even penance sounds like a big word. I mean, confession is a pretty heavy word, and I know that. I'm not going to make it fun today, but I'm going to try to add color to it a little bit. And if you also know, if you've been here the last few weeks or during this whole sermon series, I've been using the life and the teaching of Jesus as the ways in which to explain these practices. So when you talk about prayer, okay, look at what Jesus says about prayer. When you talk about fasting, look at what Jesus says about it. But with confession, that makes it very difficult, because Jesus was Jesus. He didn't have a whole lot to confess. There's not a lot of verses of Jesus confessing his sins, because he didn't have any. And we know later on that he was made to be sin, Paul says, because he didn't have any. So, I struggled and struggled. We can't really look at Jesus. He does talk about forgiveness. He does talk about confession a little bit. But I can't use him as a model for how to do confession. Instead, I wanted to pick somebody who is probably the most perfect model for confession. And that, of course, is Mr. David. David, who wrote this psalm that you read, Psalm 32, this famous psalm about confession and transgressions. It was written by David. And for those of you, I'm sure most of us in this group are familiar with David. You couldn't pick probably a bigger screw up than David. Yes, he was the king, and yes, he's famous, and all the people followed him. He was a great king, but he was a royal screw up. And because of that, it's David today, I think, who can teach us about this practice of confession, why we do it, what's the benefit of it, and how to actually do it. Because for those who aren't familiar with David, I'm just going to swing through some of his screw-ups. And those of you who are, you will know this already. We see it in the book of 2 Samuel. David is walking on top of the palace as he's king, and he looks out, of course, and he sees this woman named Bathsheba, and she's the wife of another man. But he decides, I want her. I'm the king, so I'll have her. Not only that, but then she gets pregnant. Okay? This guy's in the Bible. This is why I love the Bible, because it takes all the screw-ups and all the mistakes and all the bad things that people do, and it shows how redemption can come into it. But David, see, he doesn't just stop there. That would be one thing. He commits adultery, and she gets pregnant. David then has to cover it up. And you remember probably what he does. He takes Uriah, who's her husband, and he sends Uriah out to the front of the battlefield. And he writes a note to Joab, the leader of the army, and he says, send Uriah to the front line, and when he's out there, immediately pull back so that he'll be stricken dead. And of course, Uriah is. So here's David, and Uriah was one of his soldiers too. Here's David, okay? How many mistakes can the guy make? How many blunders can he make? The adultery, the murder. And yet we see in this passage a wonderful view of what confession is, from a person who knew that they needed confession and forgiveness like no one else. And here, the problem with approaching confession, I always make it into two categories. I called you either an Eeyore or a Pollyanna, and I always bring it down to two. I only got my record 28 minutes to do this. I can't get too complex in the typology as a people. So here, I'm going to put you into two buckets, and I know you're not going to fit in one of the buckets all the time. That's fine. But when it comes to confession and forgiveness, we tend to fall into one of these two buckets. Either we're a coverer or we're a cringer. We're either a coverer when it comes to confession and forgiveness, or we're a cringer when it comes to confession and forgiveness. And I know that you guys are one of these at any given time, because I've talked to you about stuff that you've gone through. And here, if you want a visual, a coverer, use the visual of a mask, okay? The people who wear a mask when it comes to confession and forgiveness. And if you want an image for the cringer, use a chain, and I'll explain what I mean by that. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to show from this psalm what a coverer does and what a cringer can do, what it means to wear a mask when it comes to forgiveness and confession, and what it means to wear the chain. Neither of them are good. And David gives us the gospel perspective on confession and forgiveness. Let me jump into this here. Those who cover. And there's some people in this room, I'm more on this side, I'll be honest. The coverers, the maskers. These are the people who if you talk to them, and if they're good church-going people, they'll say something like, I know I'm not perfect, but. I know I'm not perfect, but I'm not that bad. I mean, I know I'm not perfect, but I'm not perfect, but I'm not that bad. And for that type of person, if you're a coverer, if you're a masker, what you'll do with confession and forgiveness is you'll get locked into a cycle of self-rationalization to say, I'm not really that bad. And that's what David was. If you go back to 2 Samuel, he was a coverer. He was a masker. He didn't want to tell anybody about the wrongs that he had done. He didn't want anybody to know about the mistakes that he had made in his life. And so what he did was he covered. But what's interesting, if you look back at Psalm 32, if you have your Bibles open or if it's on your phone, in verse 3 and 4, you see here, the covering doesn't work. The masking never works for David. He knows the mistakes he's made, and he covers it up, and he says, no one's got to know about it. I know it's bad, but it's not that bad. It's not bad enough to confess. It's not bad enough to seek out forgiveness. But he says, you know what happens? My bones waste away. Physically, he said, you know this sometimes when you're covering up something, physically it weighs on you. The stress, you lose hair, your bones ache sometimes, any number of physical symptoms. And David says, when I cover and don't seek out confession and forgiveness, my bones wasted away. I groaned, he says. Do you remember the short story, you guys are probably all familiar with it, Edgar Allan Poe and the Telltale Heart? This is what it is. This is what Edgar Allan Poe is saying. You remember the story where the narrator looks at this old man that he's living with. He says, I didn't want his money. I didn't even dislike him. It was the eye. He says he has this eye that he can't stand. Obviously, the narrator's quite insane. But he goes in the middle of the night and he kills this man, the old man. And what does he do? Remember, it's kind of grotesque, as most Edgar Allan Poe stories are. He chops him up and he buries him into the planks under the house. And what's interesting is that when the policemen come, they say they came because the neighbors said they heard a noise. And immediately, he's a coverer. Immediately, the narrator says, oh, that noise you heard, that was me, I bumped into something. And he says, then the policemen say, well, where's the old man? And he says, oh, the old man's out in the countryside, he's traveling. He's immediately covering. But what's interesting is that the narrator in the story lives out Psalm 32, the beginning part. Because you know what happens? The policemen start talking to themselves. They say idle chatter. They're just talking about nothing important. They believe him. He said, he's rationalized it. He said, nothing's really that wrong. The noise, here's the reason for it. All rationalization, all covering up. Then the policemen start to talk. And the man says, I had an acute sense of hearing, and I heard something faint that grew and grew louder until it was deafening in his own ears. And at the end of the story, of course, he stands up and he screams to the policeman, villains! And he says, it's under the planks, it's under the planks, and he rips up the planks. What he's doing, and that's why it's called the Telltale Heart, he says it was the old man's heart. And David knows this too. You can put the planks over it. David could cover it, but it's like a blanket that'll never fit. And David says, I groaned when I didn't confess. I groaned and wasted away when I couldn't seek forgiveness. I was a masker, he would say. I was a coverer, but it didn't work. It never works. And if you look back at verse 1, blessed, I want to touch on this before we get to the next part here. I got to do it real quick. It says, blessed are the ones who are forgiven. And that word blessed, if I say, oh, you're blessed, you're probably going to think I'm saying something like, you're lucky or you have a good life or whatever. The word blessed here means complete and holistic healing. So you see what David is saying here. He's saying that the people who are forgiven, the people who confess, are the people who get the whole transformation. They start to live lives of freedom. They can start to live lives of love. He says, blessed is. He says, whole is the person. They're not scattered. They're not groaning. They're not anxious. They're not worried. They're able to confess and they're able to seek and get forgiveness. There's the best, Jesus illustrates this the best way in Luke 7. If you ever go there's the story, of course, where he's invited into the Pharisee's home, Simon, and the woman who's a former prostitute comes in and she's weeping at his feet, of course, and she's wiping his feet with her, drying it up with her hair. And of course, Simon, being the good Pharisee, doesn't like this at all and, basically rebukes Jesus and says, what are you doing? And Jesus has one of the coolest lines ever when he looks at him. And I think it's around verse 47. You can look it up. And he basically looks at him and says, Simon, you know what the difference between you and her is? She loves much because she's been forgiven much. And he said, if you don't know that you've been forgiven a lot, you're never going to love a lot. There's a direct correlation between the two. You see that. And David knows it. He says, blessed, whole is the person. Whole, the person is whole when they confess and when they forgive and when they don't cover. David, was painfully aware of his need for forgiveness and confession. He stopped being a masker. He said, I'm not going to cover up anymore. I'm going to confess it. Now, before I move on, there is a way in God talks about this in the Psalm, this whole thing about the horse and the mule. There is a way to do a fake confession. And there's plenty of people I know who do that, who say, oh, here, I'm going to confess my heart to you, but they don't really confess much. And he says, look, that's like a mule. And a mule, imagine a mule walking, and the mule says, oh, look, something over there to the left that I want to eat. And then the master says, no, you're not going to go there. So they kick him out. Okay. The mule says, okay, fine, I'll go to the right. I'll go to the right. A couple minutes later, the mule says, oh, look, another thing over there to the left I want to eat. And the master says, no, ow. He kicks him again. He's got to go to the right. Okay, then another time, you get in the pattern here. The mule says, look, something to the left I want to eat. Ow, okay, fine. I got the kick. I'll go to the right. See, there's a way in confession for it to be fake. The mule is controlled, but the mule is never changed. The mule is controlled by guilt, controlled by the master, but they're never changed. And in the psalm, it flips to where God says, I don't want you to be like the mule. I don't want you to be controlled by guilt. I want you to be changed by forgiveness. I don't want you to be controlled by rules and following every rule that the Bible says you ought to follow. He says, I want you to be melted in confession. Those are coverers. Now, there's some coverers in this room, I'm sure, and there's also some cringers. And the image here, I said, you can use it as a chain. You can either mask it, which is what David was doing in 2 Samuel when he didn't want to tell anybody about his mistakes or his offenses. Or there's some other people who cringe. And these are the folks who will say something like this. I know God could forgive me. I know others can forgive me. But I can't forgive myself. And these are the people who cringe away from confession because they feel that it's what they've done in their life, what you and I have done is too great for true forgiveness. It's too much. It's too overwhelming. And if you are that person today, if you're a cringer, if the idea of confessing what you've done wrong in the past and the idea that God could actually forgive you is so foreign to you and it almost frightens you. If you are that person, I'm going to say a few things that the Psalm tells us today. 3 things, actually. And I'm just going to lay them out there as facts. I'm going to try to give a little illustration to it. But I want you to hear these. And if you are a cringer, by the very definition of it, you're not going to agree with me today. You're going to say, that's great. He's a pastor. He's supposed to say those things. No, I'm not saying it. It's here in Psalm 32. First, if you're a cringer, know this, that when you confess and when you get forgiveness, God becomes a hiding place, not a place to hide from. Now, it's very important that you know this. He becomes a hiding place when you confess. And this is radical because this is the only God who says this. Every other God will tell you, if you make mistakes, go fix it. And until you fix it, don't come to me. God says, when you make mistakes, I'm here to hide in. You know, when I tell stories about my mom sometimes, and if I ever refer to her as my mama, that means that's when I got in trouble. So I say when my mama says this, that's when I got in trouble a lot when I was in high school. And one of the times, I'm not going to tell you what I did, but I did a minor offense in high school, nothing illegal too badly. And my mama was a teacher and a librarian. See, this is where the story's going. And she brought the pain down if I ever did anything wrong. And she knew about it because she was a teacher and a librarian at the school that I was at. That was scary. And all the teachers knew her. So one time I broke a rule for this one teacher who I didn't really like that much. And he says, I'm going to send you to the principal's. And I was a coverer. I was a masker. I said, okay, I'm bad, but I'm not that bad. I'm not as bad as those other kids. So in and out of the principal's office, no big deal. But he put the fear of my mama in me. And he said, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to call your mother and have her come to the school. And she was off that day, I guess, or she was a sub. And you know what I did immediately? I ran. I ran to the bathroom by the gymnasium, which nobody ever went to, because you would just go into the gymnasium and use that restroom in the locker room. I went to that bathroom and I went and hid in a stall. Can you imagine this? Little high school Aric, and I'm hiding in a stall because of my mother. I knew I had done something wrong, and I was cringing away in fear. And the psalmist says, listen, it's the exact opposite with God. When you and I make mistakes, we don't run away. We run to. He says, when you confess to me, I'm the only God that's going to be a hiding place for you. Every other God, if you let them down, they will crush you. God says, if you let me down, I will never crush you. I can't. I got to move on, but he's not something to hide from, he's something to hide in for the cringers in the room. And more than that, he doesn't count, it says here. He doesn't count the iniquity, David writes. The best illustration I can give you, and some of you are in school, so you know this, well, actually all of you probably went to school. You take a test, you get a bad grade. I'm talking a bomb, D-, horrible grade. And you're wrecked, you're upset about it, this big test that you've been studying for. Imagine the next day the professor comes in, says to the class, you know that test you took yesterday? I'm gonna get rid of it, tear it up. I'm gonna tear it up. It's not gonna count on your final score. We'll weight the midterm and the final a little heavier. That test you did yesterday, don't worry. Do you know the feeling you would have if a professor says that? And yet that's exactly the words that David says about God. He says, God doesn't count it. And for the cringers in the room, the people who are bound by the chains of their past mistakes, their past sins, their past wrongdoings, this is one of the hardest things to know. He does not count it anymore. It's gone. More than that, God's not just a hiding place. He doesn't just count it and strike it off the record for your life when you confess it. He also wants you to be glad. You notice the way the psalm ends. He says, in gladness, to be glad. And actually, there's a line in there where he says, he surrounds me with shouts of deliverance. And that would most likely be a direct allusion to the worship service. And here on Sundays, we never shout. But you've been at some churches, I'm sure, that does a lot of shouting and hands up and yelling and weeping. And he says, this is precisely what God intends in confession. He doesn't intend you to feel sad, feel horrible about yourself. He doesn't want you to beat yourself up. He wants you to be glad. And he says confession is the only way to get there, forgiveness and accepting it. And I put a quote in there from C.S. Lewis. I'm not going to read the whole one because we don't have the time. Look at it. C.S. Lewis sums it up like this. He says, listen, confession is this. Forgiveness is this. It's you can either deal with the pain of your tooth and have the numb pain go on and on and on, or you can know that once you pull it out, that pain, though strong, every day will be a little less and a little less. He says that's what confession is. It's the road to gladness. God does not want us to beat ourselves up. We are not some ascetic monks that have to slap ourselves on the back every 5 minutes to remind how sinful we are. No, God says, confess it, get the forgiveness, and move it on. I don't count it, neither should you. Now, that's the need for confession for those who are the coverers. That's the result of the confession for the ones who are the cringers. Those are the truths that you have to know about it. Now, how do we do it? How does it happen? In verse 1 and 5, you'll notice that he uses the word cover twice. And here's a hint. If you're ever reading the Psalms and something's repeated, it's not poetic. I mean, it is kind of poetic, but it's not meant to be poetic. It's meant to be emphasized. When psalmists repeat things, it's basically them saying, hey, whoa, hold up, look here, look. This is important. You got to know this. And the psalmist here, David, is saying, look, you have to know this thing about covering. And he says, I didn't cover it, but he says, God did cover it. And since David is a good Jew, he would know his Old Testament history, and you can't get away from the connection of the covering that David is talking about to the covering that Adam and Eve had to deal with. And remember in the garden when Adam and Eve, they were just walking around, they were naked and happy as clams. They were, the old hymn, I walk with you, I talk with you. They were walking around with God in perfect communion, and then came a moment where they looked at that tree and they said, I think we can be God just as good as God is. They didn't really say that, but that's really what they meant. They didn't just break a rule. In essence, they were saying, you know what, I think we can do this whole life thing just as good as God can. So let's take the tree and let's eat it, even though we're not supposed to. They did it, and then you know what happens immediately? In Genesis 3:7, it says that they saw that they were naked, they became ashamed, and they covered themselves. David knows this. You and I are going to try covering, or you and I are going to try cringing from confession and forgiveness. It's not easy to do, and it's not easy to accept, and I know that. David knows, though, because he groaned all day and night, because his bones were wasting away. He knew that covering wasn't going to work, and he definitely knew that cringing wasn't going to work. He knew that neither the mask nor the chains were going to help him. He knew because he knew that the original covering of Adam and Eve didn't help them. No, David knows that he needs to be covered. David needs to be covered by something outside of himself. He can't do it himself. It's a blanket that'll never fit. It'll always leave it a little bit wanting at the end. And there's a reason why. Jesus was stripped bare on the cross. He had no covering. And his arms were literally spread out open wide because he couldn't even cover himself. If you think confession and getting forgiveness is humiliating, if you think it's embarrassing to confess to somebody else, I want you to look to that mental image of Christ on the cross spread out for you, stripped bare. He couldn't cover himself because he was too busy covering you and me. If we as a community refuse to confess, if we refuse to accept that forgiveness, we'll be covering ourselves. Somebody's got to cover. There's got to be a cost that's got to be paid down. We can accept it that Jesus did it for us, that he covers us, or we can keep trying to do it ourselves. The beauty of the gospel says this. It says that yes, you and I are so sinful and so messed up, and we've made so many mistakes and so many dumb decisions in our life that there's nothing that could ever get us into the grace of God, that nothing ever that could make us whole, that can make us happy. We can never fix ourselves. We can never cover ourselves enough. The gospel says, yes, that's the truth, but also know this truth. That on the cross, when he was stripped bare and arms spread open, he was doing it so that you may be covered, because you're that loved and we are that cherished. The gospel reminds us that we're broken and we're flawed, which means we need confession. But the gospel also says you are beautiful and radiant, and therefore you get forgiveness. If you're a coverer or a clinger today, look to the cross and let that cover you. That ought to give you the humility to be able to confess your sins, your brokenness to anybody. And it ought to give you the empowerment and the sense of calm and glad to know that once you confess it, it's done. It is not counted. We're going to close, and I wish I could spend more time on this last point. There's something I want us to do as a community before, but to be honest, and this is why community is important. When David's confession comes, Go back to 2 Samuel chapter 12 if you get a chance sometime. David's confession comes when Nathan comes to him. David's confession comes in the midst of community. And this is why confession in the church history has always been called a corporate discipline. It means, and this is why we read aloud together a prayer of confession. It means that the community of believers ought to be confessing to one another. David could have sat in silence on his sins and his brokenness and his mistakes for his whole life. It wasn't until Nathan came to him, and Nathan says, I know what you did. And then immediately David is able to write a beautiful psalm like this that says, yes, I was wasting away, but now God is my hiding place. He's my refuge. It comes in community. And we're going to do something here, a little practical. You guys, if you notice on the bottom of your outline, there's a few lines here. Now, I try to be very practical. We're not washing feet again this week, but we're going to be very practical here. You all should have a pen, and on the bottom of your outline, there's a bunch of lines on the bottom of this.